Dear Lord, we are thankful and blessed to be called to this great work. Thankful and blessed to be able to gather together. And we praise you for getting Manuel and his wife Eva over um, to Elko in Nevada, where they'll be staying now for a while. And I just pray for a special blessing upon them for healing and strength and helping them with all the challenges that they've had to face. May all of us, Lord, as we see, with Tony and the health issues she has, and Kathy and all her challenges, and on top of that, now having broken her ankle or part of her leg, a portion of her leg, we just pray for all of them. And Linda dealing with physical therapy, and now Christine has a challenge that she's working on. Lord, we just pray that no matter what we go through, our faith in you may remain steadfast always, knowing that you can do great things through us, no matter what. May our faith be strong. We ask you to bless us as we continue reading through the Evangelicals, that we could grow in understanding of the line of the Protestants and the histories of failure, that is particularly as we now enter into the area of coming into 1979 in the Evangelicals. We just ask you to help us to better understand these things as they fit on the line. We praise you and thank you. And we ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so let me get up on the screen. And bear with me just a minute again. Didn't show up when I asked for it. There we go. Okay, so I wanted to remind us what chapter we're in, but I'm gonna have to back up a little bit for that. Sorry for the making everybody dizzy. I thought the table of contents was still showing on the left-hand side, but it's not. But just to give us a refresher, chapter 7, the Pentecostals and the Southern Baptists. We went through the Pentecostals and we're in the process of looking at the Southern Baptists now. So back to where we were at. Should check the page number, sorry. Okay, so we're just about done with this chapter actually. So we looked at the Pentecostals. I'm glad Donna's here because she has a lot of good insight. Thank you, Donna, on the Pentecostals. So several of these different denominations. I think you circulated through more of them than, I never circulated through any of them like you did. I just kind of stayed at home and read, discovered the Sabbath and the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and that was all I went to.
Yeah, I was definitely a seeker.
Yeah, I didn't, by the time I became a seeker, I think you just spent more time seeking or something, because by the time I set out to be a seeker, it was by myself with the Bible and that was it. So I never, all I knew is that everybody believes something different. And I was like, it just can't be right that everybody believes something different. And so I wound up learning about the Seventh-day Adventist Church and the Sabbath.
Yeah.
So that was where I went. But I learned a lot afterwards, good and bad, about the different denominations. And I'll say some things that I think I've said this before, some things that were it always puzzles me that particularly the Seventh-day Adventists, it seems to me by the time you become a Seventh-day Adventist, you should know why you're there. And so there were things as I went along the way, before I even went into the Seventh-day Adventist Church, it was real easy to see. We brought this up, I think, last week, I don't remember, but it was real easy to see who put Christ on the cross and how his people didn't know him and rejected him. And I had already, little things had already impressed my mind. I didn't understand a lot, but little things along the way impressed my mind. And some of those little things are very beneficial to today. And that the big one very early on was that history repeats itself, that there's no new thing under the sun. So I knew that things, and there's so many places where that, is depicted. So I knew there was this repetition of things. So I knew that if God's people put him on the cross, in the beginning rejected him, then there'd be God's people doing the same thing in the end. And it just is so amazing that something so simple and basic, Seventh-day Adventists can be so blind to the possibility that they would, be destroyed like the Jews were, or the nation divorced like the Jews were. So very amazing that they don't see that. Okay, so most conservative Christians were horrified by the counterculture, but a number of young evangelical ministers, most of them Pentecostals, saw the potential in it for conversions. Preaching the countercultural stance of Jesus, they took to wearing blue jeans, adopted rock and folk music, and urged getting high on Jesus and Holy Spirit baptism. Taking their inspiration from David Wilkerson, an Assemblies of God pastor, who in the 1950s had a ministry to New York City gangs, most of them focused on the casualties, the dropouts, the runaways, the homeless, and drug addicted. I'm not sure. It sounds like we already read this part. Does anybody remember?
Yeah, I think we did, but just a comment about David Wilkerson. I really did love David Wilkerson. He was so good. He was very popular in the book, in the.
He wrote a particular book, didn't he?
Yeah, I think we read all. Are we at?
Yeah, I'm gonna keep going forward. That was probably an old yellow highlight.
Yeah, chapter 8, I think it was.
Yeah, we probably yeah. Because I put yellow highlights in there, and I don't know, maybe I didn't highlight this file. Because I know we read that already. And we read about the Southern Baptists, so. Sorry, you think we're at the beginning here? Donna? Anybody remember?
I'm sorry, what?
I said, do you think we're at the beginning here?
I think we're kind of midway. I forget.
In chapter 8. Wow.
Actually, we are. Yeah, more kind of in the beginning.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I either I missed it or I didn't put a yellow highlight in here because I grabbed the other highlight and was in the wrong place. That's one from the previous time. But I have this. Yeah, here we are. Here we are. This is where we're at. Got it.
Okay, what page? Okay.
We're on page 231.
Okay.
231. And I'm just going to go back a paragraph. Okay, the division among evangelicals became obvious during the 1964 presidential campaign. After Barry Goldwater secured the Republican nomination, fundamentalist leaders, among them McIntyre, Hargis, and Jones, rallied behind him. The Arizona senator, an Episcopalian of Jewish parentage, came closer to their ideal than any other presidential candidate in the past half century. He wasn't quite conservative enough for them, but he called for a rollback of Soviet power abroad and of the New Deal at home. He had often alleged that the Reds were infiltrating the US government, the media, and the churches, and McIntyre called the media, infiltrating the US government, the media, and the churches. And McIntyre called him the only anti-communist running. Goldwater favored a constitutional amendment to reinstate Bible reading and prayer in the public schools. So there's a constitutional amendment Goldwater's wanting, and this is running against Kennedy, right? Is that right, where we're at here? So he wants a constitutional amendment to reinstate Bible reading and prayer. And the first Republican to adopt a Southern strategy, he opposed federally mandated desegregation and voted against the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Most evangelicals, however, did not share the fundamentalist enthusiasm for a candidate seen by many in his own party as a right-wing radical. It's interesting, they have no problem with that today now, do they? Most evangelicals, however, did not share the fundamentalist enthusiasm for a candidate seen by so many in his own party as a right-wing radical who had proposed that NATO commanders should have the power to use tactical nuclear weapons on their own initiative in the event of an emergency. Wow. According to a Christianity Today poll of evangelical publishers, 62% supported Johnson and 38% supported Goldwater. So which election are we looking at then? This is after Kennedy, right? Goldwater? Somebody probably has a better
Yeah,
understanding
I
of
think
the
it's after, yeah, you're right. After Kitty,
well, the next paragraph starts with after his assassination, so it must be because it's talking about civil rights in 1964.
yeah, I think it might have been after, I don't know, I
I
forget.
have to go verify my history. I was born in 61, so I don't know a lot back then. According to Christianity Today poll of evangelical publishers, 62% supported Johnson and 38% supported Goldwater. And because it was Johnson that was, Johnson's the one that took, after Kennedy was assassinated, took over, right? A ratio roughly that all of American vote, that of all American voters. New South evangelicals felt comfortable voting for their fellow Southern Democrat, Lyndon Johnson, and in spite of their Republican sympathies, most Northern evangelical leaders avoided associating themselves with Goldwater and took no part in the campaign. Goldwater won just 6 states, his own and the 5 in the Deep South. Shortly after Kennedy's assassination, Graham offered his services to the new president, Johnson, whom he had known slightly for years. And Johnson, eager for his support, enveloped him in a bear hug, enveloped him in a bear hug. A few days before the election, Graham received over 1 million telegrams and 10,000 of other messages urging him to come out for Goldwater. Johnson called him to say, "Billy, you stay out of politics," and then invited him to spend the weekend at the White House, where he couldn't read his mail. In July 1964, Graham agreed to join a citizens committee to oversee the implementation of the Civil Rights Bill. And a month later, he and his wife spent a night at the White House. In the 4 years, tell him to stay out of politics, but invite him to the White House. Sounds kind of strange.
Yeah, because Lyndon was he was like everybody loved him, and he really loved people. And so he was more of a people person. So I think he just did it just to get to, just to come over, because he was like that. He was like a dad or granddad where he'd come over and have something to eat. Him and Lady Bird, they were very sociable. Very sociable.
So in 1964, Graham agreed to join the Citizens Committee to oversee the implementation of the Civil Rights Bill. And a month later, he and his wife spent a night at the White House. In the 4 years that followed, Johnson often invited Graham to the White House and to his Texas ranch. "I almost used the White House as a hotel when Johnson was president," Graham later said. "He was always trying to keep me there. He just wouldn't let me leave." Johnson attended some of Graham's crusades, sought his spiritual and political advice, and told him little inside stories about foreign heads of state. He turned Graham into his confidant, and as he hoped, Graham supported the Great Society programs as well as the administration's civil rights initiatives. Just as important, Graham gave his blessing to Johnson's escalation of the war in Vietnam. Encouraged by the president, he toured South Vietnam in December 1966 as a guest of General William Westmoreland and announced, "Communism has to be stopped somewhere. Whether it is in Hawaii or on the West Coast, the president believes it should be stopped in Vietnam." Like most Americans, evangelicals supported the Vietnam War when American troops began to pour into the country. And like many others, they knew little about Vietnam itself, but believed the American effort necessary to stop the spread of communism from China through Southeast Asia and even to the shores of the United States. In 1966, for example, the NAE passed a resolution decrying any action by our government that would favor communism under the leadership of Red China, without mentioning Vietnam. For fundamentalists and others, the domino theory had an extra dimension. Stopping godless communism was John R. Rice maintained a holy and righteous cause. The editor of the Kentucky Baptist Convention Convention's Western reporter wrote, "Communism must be stopped somewhere, or this godless darkness will cover the earth." Even Graham initially seemed to see the war in religious terms. The communists are moving fast toward their goal of world revolution, he wrote Johnson in July 1965. "Perhaps God brought you to the kingdom for such an hour as this, to stop them. In doing so, you could be the man that helped save Christian civilization." So they definitely see, or we're seeing communism as a threat, and Billy Graham is being, what's the word I'm looking for? In a right place, according to them, at the right time. There's a particular word I'm looking for, but instrumental in the influence when it came to seeing communism as the threat and this godless communism. And it's amazing how they link it to, well, maybe it's not so much, but they link it to the Democrats and the liberals, communism and socialism. Does anybody know when and where that link began and why?
What link?
The link of how they the far right is accusing the left of being communist and socialist.
Oh yeah, that's right. Well, it wasn't the McCarthy era, was it?
I don't know.
Did it become
When they started considering
they started accusing people of being communists and
does it go back to the New Deal? Does it go back to the New Deal, because they saw the New Deal as socialism, right? And they wanted to get rid of that.
I don't know if it went all the way back to the New Deal. I'm not sure.
It's just interesting as I'm thinking, because we know that the king of the South is Russia, right? And in this time here, this is before it's just Russia and the Soviet Union. And but I'm just thinking about some other things that I've been reading and studying, and the king of the North and king of the South, and the king of the South is Russia, and we know that I'm thinking of Daniel chapter 8, which verse I can't remember, 5 or 6, when they have to take out 3 territories. The South. There's somebody, David, if you're there and you remember, the South, the East, and the glorious land. Is that correct? If David's there, he probably remember, or anybody else that might remember.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I'm here. I'm just trying to get myself together here, but I think that's right. It's I can see it in my Bible. The North, the South, glorious land. I could look it up.
It's not the North, it's the East. Yeah, if you have it, I can find it on my phone too real quick. And
Now you got me curious. I got to go look now.
it's been on my mind as well because of a verse I read in Isaiah 52 that takes you all the way back into history. And let me see if you look for that one, and I'm going to try and find this verse. Yeah, I'll read mine first, and then if you find that, I know it's Daniel 8, 4, 5, 6 somewhere.
Yeah,
You got it?
It's 8, 9.
Okay.
Get better light here. It says, "And out of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceedingly great toward the south, towards the east, and then towards the pleasant land." That's Daniel 8, 9.
It says southeast in the pleasant land.
Yeah.
Okay. Because this verse in Isaiah 52 is verse 4. "For thus saith the Lord God, my people went down aforetime into Egypt to sojourn there, and the Assyrian oppressed them without cause. And it took me back very early on, and you look at all the different times where God's people went into Egypt. Abraham went there. Isaac went there. It's Isaac, yeah. And he was sporting with his wife, and so if you look at it parable wise, or literally, that God's people were prone to always go to Egypt. We know that the Egypt today to be the world. So I've been kind of thinking about the process of the king of the north and the king of the south. But they go to the world, according to that verse. They go to the world, and then they're oppressed by the Assyrian. Egypt was the south, and Assyrian was the north, because Assyria is the lion, and then Babylon was the young lion. They both were the king of the north. And so it was the king of the north and the king of the south, and God's people go to the king of the south, and they wind up oppressed by the king of the north. And I was trying to think of how that, what that looks like, that God's people are in the world, and yet they're, I've got all these thoughts rolling through my head that they're called out of Babylon, right? But and somebody help me out here, because the Laodicean condition is that worldliness. The Laodicea condition is the worldliness and the involvement with racism, sexism, and homophobia. It's like I'm trying to sort them all out to what they are, but in that particular verse, going to Egypt causes you to be oppressed by the Assyrians without cause. And then I'm thinking about the Dark Ages, where they wound up in the times that they go into captivity, and they're oppressed by Babylon, by the king of the north. And back in that period of time, or from pagan Rome to papal Rome, you have that period of time where Rome's divided into 10 divisions, and that's to be repeated. So I've been really thinking about where we go as we get to the Sunday law, and I know we'll have more light as we continue to go on, that if that's to be repeated, the king of the south is Russia will be taken out. We know that, right? The east, say it again, the east, the south, and the pleasant land, right? So then,
yes.
So it's, we're not going to figure this out tonight. I'm going to keep reading, but I just wanted to share some thoughts that maybe somebody at another time might be working on such thoughts as well. But those 10 kings will be repeated, and we know in Revelation 17 that those 10 kings must represent. Well, what did they represent in that history? What did they represent? They were the kings. They were the state. Is that right? And then you had the church that was over those kings, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So you're going to have this resurrection of this beast. Wow, there's a lot to keep sorting out in our heads, because it's the beast, but it's also Rome, and it's the papacy comes back. So anyway, so a lot of entities playing in part because she's going to rule over those 10 kings. Those 10 kings, it says in Revelation 17, because God put it in their heart to give their power over to the beast. So I'm starting to look at and think what happens to the Democrat Party, because they're going to get slapped and lose. And Republicans and far right is going to win, and that'll be the end of them. And that'll be the end of the United States as we know it anyways. And then it becomes the 10 kings. I don't know, I'm kind of rambling, but I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that. I've been thinking those things, of how these things repeat. Anybody have any thoughts on that?
No.
Was that a no?
Yeah, that was a no.
Those are no.
It's deep.
I know, and there's so many players involved, but if it repeats, and that's why this particular paragraph got me to there when they call the Democrats godless communism. So we know that Russia receives a deadly wound and dies, and so the king of the South is gone. But then also Egypt is the world, so which is the king of the South. I don't know if anybody understands what I'm trying to say, because I'm just trying to sort it all out, and I'm probably saying more than I need to right now because I don't understand it myself.
Well, I know that the church is the serpent, or the false religion, and the state is the dragon power. And the rulers and the governors are represented as the dragon power, and they've taken upon themselves the mark of the beast, which is the papacy.
Right.
And yeah, I'm doing a study right now, so I'm kind of reading off of some of my notes. There's a religious and civil.
Okay, right here is just something.
Somebody say something.
It sounds like.
Is that Kathy or David?
It sounds like.
Yeah, Kathy's having some pain.
Oh no.
You go to bed.
Oh no.
She's gonna go wipe out.
Okay.
I'm
So
moving, that's fine.
is she talking to us or you? I'm gonna mute if she's talking to you.
Yeah, she's talking to me. I'm muting myself. Goodbye.
Okay.
Oh.
Okay, so yeah, anyways, I've been thinking a lot about a lot of things, and also the seven thunders. So I hope to have more put together as we continue to go forward, and that we might look at it another time. But anyways, because it's always struck me that they call the Democrats socialists and communists. And this is where, and this is Johnson that is supporting the stopping of communism, and Vietnam being a place where it's going to spread, and we got to stop it somewhere. And Billy Graham seems to be instrumental in this. Okay, so after the Tet Offensive in early 1968, okay, we got to look this one up if anybody knows what it is.
Yeah, look it up. I got a friend here that he was there, and he said a lot of stuff changed once that went on.
The Tet Offensive?
Yeah.
Wikipedia. It says Vietnamese was a major escalation of one of the largest military campaigns of the Vietnam War. Okay, it was launched January 30th, 1968 by forces of the Viet Cong. Okay. The offensive was launched prematurely in the late night of the hours. Okay, so it's one of the battles, correct, in Vietnam.
Yeah, it's one of the battles, and it was kind of a turning point where things were coming apart.
Yeah, that's when the Viet Cong attacked all the bases at once on a certain day. It was bad.
Campaign of surprise attacks against military and civilian command and control centers throughout South Vietnam. The name is the truncated version of the Lunar New Year festival name in Vietnamese. Okay. Okay, so after the Tet Offensive in early 1968, many Americans turned against the war, but evangelicals generally remained steadfast. In its many resolutions on the war, the Southern Baptist Convention never questioned government policies or the morality of the war. The convention included a small anti-war party, but according to surveys, the vast majority of Southern Baptist ministers supported the war to the end. Fundamentalists such as Bob Jones Jr., many of the older neo-evangelicals, and many Southern Baptist ministers favored stronger military measures. All the same, many evangelicals harbored doubts about why the U.S. was fighting in Vietnam. The Southern Baptist Convention, which in 1967 had resolved support for the self-determination of the peoples of smaller countries, and the prosecution of a defensive war, made no further mention of American war aims. The NAE as a body fell into silence on the subject, and Billy Graham, who registered popular evangelical opinion, began describing Vietnam as one of the greatest dilemmas in US history in Southeast Asia. When demonstrators swarmed after his car on the UCLA campus, he submitted, "Vietnam is difficult, confused, complex, and perplexing. I can make no moral judgment on whether we should have troops in the first place," but added that because the US had made the commitment, we should see it through to a satisfactory conclusion. After a second tour through Vietnam at Christmas time 1968, he made the definite statement, "The war is already won militarily. Right now, 73% of the Vietnamese people are under South Vietnam's government," only to turn about and say, "I don't comment on Vietnam because it's a complicated problem." Questions about the horrific toll the war was taking on Vietnamese civilians elicited what Marshall Frady called obtuse little homilies. "We have all had our mylaeus in one way or another." There's another one, anybody?
Wasn't that the
Massacre, okay. Mass murder of unarmed South Vietnamese civilians by US troops, okay. With a thoughtless word, an arrogant act, or a selfish deed. So he's comparing that to what we do with our own personal lives. Is that what I just read? Questions about the horrific toll the war was taking on Vietnamese civilians elicited what Marshall Frady called obtuse little homilies. "We have all had our mylaeus," is that how you say it? Laeus, life, "in one way or another, with a thoughtless word, an arrogant act, or a selfish deed." So he's comparing this massacre to us mistreating somebody. Is that
Yes.
what you guys
And
are?
that's what I see.
That's okay. A few days, so in other words, it's no big deal. Is that how you guys are understanding what he just said? That he's not thinking it's any big deal. A few days before the 1973 Paris Peace Accords and the withdrawal of the last US troops, he offered a judgment of perfect ambiguity. "I don't think we should fight these long drawn out half-hearted wars." Unable to explain how holy war against communism had turned into a murky conflict in a small, poor country, evangelical ministers generally avoided the subject on Sundays and preached about the disturbances at home. In 1966 and 1967, Graham's radio program, Hour of Decision, featured such sermons as "A Nation Rocked by a Crime," "Students in Revolt," "Flames of Revolution," "Rioting, Looting, and Crime." By the summer of 1967, nearly all of his sermons dealt with the anarchy in America. Evangelical organizations also expressed horror at the anti-war protests. The 1966 NAE resolution titled "The New Treason" read, "Believing that the authority of the state is sanctioned by God, the NAE deplores the burning of draft cards, subversive movements, and seditious utterances, and prevalent disloyalty to the United States of America." Fundamentalists and others decided the urban riots, blaming them on the civil rights leaders and the acquiescence of liberal politicians, or as Rice put it, the lawlessness of Martin Luther King and others, and the pussyfooting politicians who want the Negro vote. Wow. Americans have a heart problem, don't they?
Yeah, they do.
And they have had it for a long time. and just, another side note, I mentioned the Seven Thunders, but through the study that we're doing in Reunion, reviewing all those, I'm not yet working on, but I partially transcribed the one that's on the Seven Thunders. But I think having been partway through that again, and then the ones that I am working on, the ones that we've done, he's put up on the board several times is that relation between the 4 and the 3, the 4 and the 3, or the 7 and the 4, and the 7 and the 3. And I have come to understand that the Seven Thunders being a period, we know a good portion of it, but being a period from the time of the end till the destruction. And, in a reform line, I'm just being general terms, in a reform line. And that there's 7 kings involved, and we'll see more details on that when we get to that particular presentation, but 7 kings involved, but 4 in particular singled out, which takes you to, it comes from Leviticus 26 of the 4 progressive destructions. So the number 4, he's been emphasizing, representing this progressive destruction, which I think we're all familiar with. So what you have is from the time of the end till the destruction, you have the number 4 symbolizing the progressive destruction simultaneous with, because at the time of the end, you also have the beginning of the 3 angels message. So the 4 is the progressive destruction. The 3 is the 3 angels messages going on simultaneously from the time of the end till the destruction, separating 2 classes of people. And I don't know why this particular paragraph linked it to me. Well, I think it linked to me because of the heart problem that people have. So the message from God is going to stir your heart and draw you to Him. Or I don't know what's inside a person that they can be so callous, like what we just read here, and just have such a heart problem when it comes to, and it totally makes sense that the message of the 4 commandments is already done, and it's the message of love your neighbor, because that's, I mean, plain what I seem to be getting out of this paragraph here, that there's such a lack of love for humanity. So the civil unrest of the period alarmed many Americans, but evangelical leaders ran the disturbances together and envisioned a monster that few others saw. In 1969, the NAE spoke of a crisis of unparalleled proportions. A social revolution with economic overtones has made arson, looting, mayhem, and murder commonplace in some metropolitan areas. A social revolution with economic overtones. Sorry, I'm just going back in here and reading. So the social revolution, somebody help me because I have a really hard time with comprehension. So social revolution here, isn't that talking about the civil rights movement? Yes. That's what I thought. Okay. So with that economic overtones has made arson, looting, mayhem. So they're, and I'm sure that was going on in some aspects, but that's not what Martin Luther King stood for.
No, he was not. But I guess what it's implying is that some who were in support of the civil rights unrest, the revolution, had economic interests that they were, and they were, the civil rights brought economic opportunities. And so they went in it not so much for the civil rights, but for economic overtones. Yeah. Which I think happens all the time. And it might even be with, the revolution that we're having now, with the inequality and stuff. Some people could be in it just for the economic opportunities.
I'm just looking at this part of it here. It made arson, looting, mayhem, and murder commonplace in some metropolitan areas. Because with the whole Black Lives movement, they don't get the concept of the movement because they've got racism in their hearts. And so they have a lack of love for humanity. And all they want to look at is the people that do bad as a result of it. And they don't want to look at the cause. They don't want to reason from cause to effect. And how did these people wind up getting to such a mindset? The ones that do the looting and the mayhem and the murder, right? What, nobody wants to look at the cause, or I don't want to say nobody, but that far right won't look at the cause, because to look at the cause, they'd have to look in the mirror.
Yes, and it's just like with medicine, when you get medications, all it does is treat the symptoms, but it never goes down, it never cures you, it's never designed to cure or get down to the root of the cause of that illness and the symptoms of that illness. So it's kind of the same concept.
Yeah, and why they want to erase and not and get rid of the critical race theory, right? And not have and rewrite history so that students don't always have to be reminded or taught these truths, and to them they're not true. Susan put in the chat, there were some civil rights leaders that believed violence was the way, and they differed with MLK. Yeah, I could see that when I was thinking of, when I read that, Susan, I was thinking of Martin Luther as well, because there were those back in the Reformation, same thing, Martin Luther wasn't about violence, but then there were others that took matters in their own hands and thought they were doing Martin Luther's work and using violence. So there's always those that do that way, but they never get to the cause. And like I said, if they wanted to get to the cause, they'd have to begin by looking in the mirror. And but they want to ignore what the oppression that is still going on in this.
Use it as an excuse.
Huh?
They use it as an excuse to discount the movement as a whole. Oh, look at those lawless people,
Yeah. So they don't have to look at it.
Yep.
And there's in Isaiah 51, the very last verse, it says, but I will put it in, he's talking about the cup of his fury. I will put it into the hand of them that afflict thee, which have said to thy soul, bow down that we may go over. And thou hast laid thy body as the ground and as the street to them that went over.
But then they ignore the January 6th and the Charlottesville, and they ignore and then they justify it.
Right. It's really a messed up mindset.
It's amazing. It's one-track minded for sure.
Unable to see. Okay, so in 1970, the normally stolid Southern Baptist Convention gave way to panic about communist subversion. A month before its June convention, the Ohio National Guard had shot and killed 4 students at Kent State University. Before its June convention, the Ohio National Guard had shot. That's the tower, right? Somebody help me with that. No, that was in Texas. Is that correct? Yeah, that's in Texas.
Say again?
Yeah, that was a big deal in Kent State. Is that Texas? Kent State, Texas?
No, it says Ohio.
No, that's
That's
Ohio. Yeah.
That was huge. I mean, that was huge.
Oh, that was cuckoo.
I mean, we couldn't.
Yeah.
I don't think. I mean, as Americans, can you even believe that this happens on American soil with the kids protesting and then they're being shot and killed? I mean, I just can't imagine.
Right.
But one of
it was horrifying.
Yeah.
One of its resolutions that year read, we urge the present administration to continue its vigilant and peaceful efforts to contain radical extremists, as well as the encroachment of conspiratorial communism at home and abroad. Another resolution, conspiratorial communism at home and abroad. So implying that there's communism here within Americans. Is that right?
Yeah, so the communisms are, of course, the liberals.
Right.
the liberal socialists.
Right. Another resolution warned a breakdown in law and order is a weapon being used by some to destroy our form. Breakdown in law and order is a weapon being used by some to destroy our form of government in the United States, with the success of these nefarious efforts being evident in many areas of our country. Graham titled one sermon, "Can America Survive?" and declared it likely that in less than 10 years, there will be internal chaos and a political tyranny in the form of some left-wing or right-wing dictatorship, even if there is no war. Declared it likely in less than 10 years, there will be, it's kind of interesting that he's saying either the left or the right dictatorship, even if there's no war.
Yeah, that's interesting that he said that.
He's not saying it's one or the other. He's saying it's going to be
Both.
both. Such statements were on the face of them puzzling, for most Americans believe their democracy strong enough to resist all the buffeting. Evangelicals, however, had a particular respect for authority and a particular fear of disorder. According to fundamentalist tenets, obedience to constituted authority was the cardinal principle of Christian society. Children were to obey their parents, wives their husbands, and citizens the state, just as all humans were to obey God. And God, as Graham once said, does not tolerate disorder. Then, as the 1966 National Association of Evangelicals, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Then, as in 1966, NAE resolution suggested many evangelicals believed that the government was established by God. Resolution suggests many evangelicals believed that the government was established by God to preserve the civil order. And where have we heard that before, that the government was established by God? What they've been trying to do all along, what they did and tried to do by stamping the "In God We Trust" on the coins, got to get God in our government. So that the government was established by God to preserve the civil order. A 1967 SBC resolution on Vietnam contained the curious sentence, "We uphold in prayer the men who are engaged in restrictive measures against the destructive forces of invasion, so that law and order may obtain." For over a century, white Southerners had looked to government as the guarantor of white rule, preferring order to democracy and living in constant anxiety about a Black rebellion. Such attitudes do not, when you back to Pharaoh, mark that so I don't lose my place. When you go back to Pharaoh, why did Pharaoh order all the baby boys to be killed?
Because he didn't want to share the throne. He was afraid that someone greater was going to overthrow him, and he didn't want to share that. He didn't want to relinquish that power. He was afraid.
But also that they were many in
He's afraid
number.
of the slaves.
Yeah, because they would grow in number. They were continuing to grow in number, and they would, turn into an army and then.
Oh yeah, that's Pharaoh. Yeah, right.
And
right.
So they were always afraid of a rebellion.
Yeah.
So they wanted to kill off all the baby boys and slow down that reproduction.
Oh yeah.
To keep them oppressed and slaves, rather than being able to get big enough and large enough to go into rebellion.
Yeah. Because their numbers are great.
Such attitudes do not disappear overnight or over centuries. During the peaceful sit-ins of 1960, Billy Graham had pronounced, no matter what law may be, it may be an unjust law, I believe we have a Christian responsibility to obey it. Otherwise, you have anarchy. By 1969, he and others were predicting not just anarchy, but a secularized version of Armageddon. Richard Nixon made his political comeback in 1968, championing religious faith, strong families, respect for public authority, and the rule of law. Richard Nixon, along with his opposition to the busing of public school children to achieve integration, his call for law and order was his Southern strategy. And it was just what most evangelicals wanted to hear. Northern evangelicals happily returned to their home in the Republican Party, while evangelicals of the New South, turned off by both the Democratic left and crude racism of George Wallace, voted for Nixon and the social conservatism he espoused. Wallace did well in southern rural counties, but Nixon carried many of the suburban counties and 5 southern states outside the Deep South. Then during his first term, Nixon continued to court evangelicals by making public displays of his religiosity and attempting to resuscitate Eisenhower's civil religion. Does somebody else want to read?
I'll read. Graham had kept in touch with Nixon through the years of political exile, and Johnson's decision not to seek re-election freed him to support his old friend. As usual, he kept saying he would avoid political involvement. But as the campaign progressed, he made so many comments about Nixon's high principles and deep religious convictions as to make a formal endorsement unnecessary. There is no American I admire more than Richard Nixon, he said, while introducing the candidate's 2 daughters to a crusade audience in Portland, Oregon that May. Apparently, he meant it, for at the Republican convention, he virtually joined the campaign, and during Nixon's first term in office, he served as Nixon's White House preacher and as his ambassador to evangelicals.
So Nixon was Republican, right?
Yes,
And Johnson was Democrat.
yes.
So-
However, Nixon was born and raised in California, and Johnson was born and raised in Texas, the southern part of Texas. Isn't that interesting? The conservative southern part of Texas.
Right.
Isn't that interesting?
But Graham was really linked with Johnson, and then he totally links with Nixon, because we know that that's what hurts him later, because he even supports him after Watergate. It's just interesting. Like Billy Graham is like, he's all over the place, it seems like sometimes.
Yeah, he was one of those, one of those people or those pastors that just wants to go down the middle road.
Yeah.
They never want to be too hot or too cold, because for fear that people might hate them and not like them. So they're really not in it for the right reasons. They're really, unfortunately, it seems as if their conviction is too weak, and they're not willing to stand up for righteousness because for fear that people may criticize them, or maybe not, they might not be so popular. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah, well, I don't know if it's later in the book here, we've covered it or not, but he had a problem, Billy Graham, with liking to be hanging out with the powerful.
Yeah.
That's why he was seeking Nixon and Johnson and whoever, was a presidential person. I think he had a little deal with Kennedy, and he just liked to be linked up with them. He had a fascination with that somehow, and that does become his downfall, of course, with Nixon here.
Yeah, it does. And he liked to hobnob with the rich and famous and powerful.
Yeah.
the shakers and the movers, So, yeah, that was his, and it was his, and Nixon was his total downfall. But even though Nixon was his downfall, it was an open door into going to preach the gospel to the world. And when he preached the gospel to the world, because he left America, basically he didn't want to do anything in America, so he went to travel the world and preach the gospel, and his heart and mind was changed when he did that. So it was kind of a curse and a blessing at the same time.
Yeah, he learned his lesson, and that was the good thing.
Yeah, it was, because when he said something about, well, before he went on that worldwide harvest, I guess evangelism, he said, before I thought that I would look at these little Chinese children and I thought that they were destined for hell. And after he went on that worldwide evangelism, he said, I don't think that way anymore. And so it really did change him, He started to see people for human beings.
Which is interesting, because that's where the Seven Thunders is supposed to take us, to see human beings, at least in our dispensation, right? To see human beings, the three angels' messages to bring us to see human beings for what they are.
And I believe that we are doing that just now, and we've been doing it for a while, because we've been doing that research and discussion, which we're learning about the inequalities in the world, and it's just broadens your mind. I mean, it's amazing. Like you're not so involved with yourself anymore. You're looking out, and if these conservative Christians would just do that, their whole life would change. I mean, their whole mindset, but they live in a little bubble.
Yeah.
And remember that video that you had shared once, what is it, white, with that Muslim woman, oh God, what was her name? Anyway, it was that documentary where she goes out on a limb and she goes and interviews these
the white
supremacists.
Yeah.
And they're very, they're very scary, because they, they hate Muslims, they hate Jews, they hate everybody, right? But at the end of her project or in her interviews, they actually loved her.
Yeah.
And they formed a friendship where they kept in touch with each other. And there were like 6 of the guys that she had met, they all left the white supremacy, because of what she shared, just by her testimony and the way she was. And you do have to come out of your comfort zone, and you've got to
meet love.
Yeah, you've got to meet people, and you've got to try different foods, try a different culture, do something, but get out of your little world that you live in, your little bubble. There's so much more to life.
I posted another verse in here that I've just been really stuck in, Isaiah 51 and 52. But because I posted this on Facebook this morning, along with a couple other things, but Isaiah 52:5, now therefore, what have I here, saith the Lord, that my people is taken away for naught. And if you remember when we did chapter 50, verse 1, is talking about how they're, he's given them a rhetorical question that, I'm not the one that divorced you, you sold yourselves. And you did all this to yourself. Anyway, so it says, they that rule over them make them to howl. So you've got the rulers and those that they're ruling, and the rulers are making the ones that they're ruling to howl, or to, what's another word for howl? Another phrase for howl. You cry out.
Right, the loud cry, yeah, right.
Or cry out, not the loud cry, but the cry out, but maybe that would be the loud cry externally, causes them to cry out, or the cry, and the cries are heard of the Lord of Sabaoth, that verse. Okay, so those that rule are ruling over, the people that they're ruling over the people are crying out. And my name is continually, every day, is blasphemy. Okay, so who's blaspheming his name in that verse? continually, every day. It made me think about today what we see, how backwards people are with religion. That you've got the rulers, and whatever it is that they're doing, how they're ruling is causing the people to howl. And look at what we're seeing with the Black Lives Matters and all these issues, the LGBT community, women's rights. Look at all these issues. They're all crying out, right? And what is the far right doing and saying about it? It's how they're handling it, all in the name of God. They're blaspheming
Yeah.
God continuously.
Yes.
Do you
Yeah.
see that?
Yeah, I see it. Yeah, definitely. I mean, it really is a blaspheming, because when you can watch people crying out and totally disregard them and not have a heart, that is that's blaspheming to God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the far right is all in the name of God. They want to deny the rights of blacks, women, homosexuals,
Mm-hmm.
and think they all deserve destruction and death while they're going to live. And so they're continuously, daily blaspheming God's name.
Right. And they don't see that they're just like, you know, the Taliban and Sharia law. They don't see that
Yeah, exactly.
they're just like them, and they don't see it.
They don't see it.
And God gave that, you know, I mean, it's so blatant. Everybody sees what Sharia law is all about.
You know, on a real smaller scale, we're
Mhm.
kind of like that in human nature. We don't see the very things we're doing. It's so easy to see what somebody else is doing.
Oh yeah.
Doing the very same thing and not see it in ourselves
Yes.
that somebody else is doing. And so here's a bigger scale that the very same thing that is happening here, they're accusing others of, and think that others need to be destroyed for doing it.
Yes, exactly. And they're not looking in the mirror. They're
Right.
and the more you look at others, the more you definitely not looking at yourself.
Well, we're constantly trying to take out the splinter in somebody's eyes when we ourselves have the log in our eyes.
Yeah, we're hypocrites.
Wow.
Hypocrites. That's what God thinks.
Well, I think
Not long. Am I at not long?
yeah, not long. I think so.
Not long after the invasion of Cambodia and the Kent State shootings, he invited Nixon to address his crusade audience in Knoxville. Then, after Nixon made his historic opening to China, Graham, briefed by National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger's staff, promoted the new China policy to the Taiwan government and to American evangelicals. That's definitely church and state. During the 1972 campaign, he officially endorsed Nixon, advised his aides on political strategies, and encouraged them to regard evangelicals as a potential voting bloc. Increasingly, however, he found himself under attack from within this bloc. For the Nixon years coincided with the emergence of a small but vocal evangelical left. Ooh, that's interesting.
So hang on one second. During the campaign, he officially endorsed Nixon, advised his aides on political strategies, and encouraged them. So this is Graham, right? Encouraged them to regard evangelicals as a potential voting bloc. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Nixon's a conservative, right? A Republican.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes, Nixon is a Republican, and he is a conservative.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's funny how Billy Graham is again riding the center line, because he's
right. That's what
likes Nixon, and then he likes LBJ.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. In the years after World War II, young evangelicals poured into higher education along with the rest of their peers. According to a Gallup poll, 1 in 6 evangelicals had been to college by the mid-1970s, a proportion well below the national average, but one much larger than in the 1960s. So evangelicals beginning to educate themselves, get involved with that. Some went to secular colleges and universities. Others attended evangelical liberal arts. Hold on, sorry. Liberal arts college, whose size and numbers grew with the same government subsidies that went to secular colleges. Many of these resembled Bible schools in their teaching methods, their narrow curricula, and their efforts to shield students from the larger culture. So conservative mindsets. Still a number, such as Wheaton and Calvin, a Dutch Reformed college, taught critical thinking and offered a wider range of intellectual fare. Well, that's interesting. They taught critical thinking. Geez. Most evangelical students, wherever they went, remained as politically conservative as their parents, but some responded to the reformist cause of the period. On secular campuses, many put aside their religion and melded into the various student protest movements. Other students worked to reconcile their faith with social reform and with help from young evangelical scholars rediscovered the social message of the gospel. Yeah.
There you go, like you had the old school, new school, the old side, new side, you've got it happening
Yes.
continuously. So here, this is what's happening. They're going to branch off. Some of them are going to break away and become liberals, right?
Yes, and this starts the social gospel.
Yeah.
That's what Rick Warren's church was, a social gospel. They were very liberal in their mindset. Beginning in the mid-1960s, evangelical student protests occurred here and there across the country. At some of the top evangelical colleges, students created small, pale versions of the rebellions on the secular campuses. Okay, so they started these small little test protests, I guess. At Wheaton, the student newspaper objected to fundamentalist structures like bans on moviegoing and card playing, and to compulsory ROTC training for freshmen and sophomores. That's interesting. Organizations such as Americans for Democratic Action began to crop up, as did informal clothes. By the late 1960s, some students were denouncing racism and holding prayer vigils against the Vietnam War. Wow.
That tug going on.
That's great. Wow. See,
Some of
God,
them becoming more involved with humanity.
with the social issues of the day. Yeah. They're seeing what's happening with the external events.
You know, it's amazing because you can be a part of something and not realize you're a part of it until I don't know what it is. There's something in the heart. I don't know what it is, but because we see some that just dig their heels in and hate and continue to hate and think, and I think it's because they're continuously, daily blaspheming God. They actually believe that what they're doing is God's will. So they can't even see themselves as doing anything wrong. But some people, and it's interesting because that's what turns a lot of people off with religion when they behave that way, with that behavior. They turn away from religion because they think if that's who God is, then I don't want anything to do with him.
Yes, exactly.
So they're causing this rift and this split. Okay.
Yeah, I've noticed a trend, like a lot of times when the youth step up and protest, because it's always the youth, you know, that starts these radical changes. The youth are always right. I mean, you know, what they're saying in their, you know, in their, I don't want to say ignorance, but in their innocence, I guess, maybe not even innocence, but they're realizing that there's true injustice. And a lot of times you see these movements, they all started from like youths. that protested and said, no, this is not right. We're going to change it. We want to change this.
Think about the clay. If anybody's ever worked with clay, you know, it eventually, you know, I think you can rework clay if it dries out a little bit, get some water into it, but it can get to a point that hardens and hardens and hardens, and maybe that's why the youth, their heart is not yet unworkable. They may grow up. It kind of sounds like some of these that they're talking about, they're from that conservative mindset. They go to these colleges and start to get exposed to humanity and want to, you know, start causes and efforts and such to be different and change and bring in some of the they wanted to undo some of the strictness is what they wanted to undo, but they start to see humanity from a different perspective.
Right.
And their heart is not yet hard. Maybe that's why it's the older ones that aren't part of it so much. It's the younger ones because their hearts aren't hardened to it yet. But if they would have stayed steadfast in their course along following their parents, not broke free from the mindset of the parents and just gone along with it, then maybe their hearts would have been, and some of them do, their hearts become hard as well and unchangeable.
Right. I know for me, growing up very strict Catholic, when I left home, I didn't want anything to do with Catholicism for sure. I mean, it just put a bad taste in my mouth, anything about Christianity, you know. So I started seeking other spiritual, you know, avenues of things, you know. I mean, I went off the deep end. I went to Rosh Nish, and, you know, I remember sitting in one of these Rosh Nishi things and everybody's wearing orange, and they had like this hippie thing in Hawaii, and they're all sitting with their legs crossed, and they've got their eyes closed and everything, and they're telling me what to do. You know, you got to do these transcendental meditations, right? And I'm like, okay, I'm in the stance, sitting, and I'm going, okay, so what am I gonna do now? What I'm like, what exactly are they doing? And they're like, okay, well, you got to just free your mind, you know, you just let go and just empty your mind. And I'm thinking to myself, I have never been able to empty my mind. How am I going to do that now? You know? So I just, you know, because I wanted to do anything but Catholicism for sure. And I didn't even consider Christianity or Protestantism because all I knew was Catholicism. And I wanted to I was done. I mean, I looked at my mother and I said, if that's what Catholicism does to a person, I want nothing of it.
Well,
yeah, anyway. Okay, at Calvin College, students' unrest culminated in the 1970 with the presentation of a youth manifesto to the local synod of the denomination, the Christian Reformed Church, complaining of racism, male chauvinism, lack of support for the conscientious objector to the war, and the construction of expensive buildings in the face of urban poverty. Wow, that's neat.
so they went to the, let's see, a youth manifesto to the local synod of their denomination. They presented
Christian Reformed Church.
gave them their complaints.
Complaining of racism, male chauvinism, lack of support for conscientious objectors.
Those who didn't want to fight in the Vietnam War.
Yeah, and the construction of expensive buildings in the face of urban poverty. You see how the youth have it all right? They can see it. They can see it.
Yeah, well, that's, yeah.
In most secular colleges and universities.
Hold on, one quick thought, because I've seen people compare Bezos and Bezos, is that how you say his name?
Yeah, Jeff, yeah.
In Tesla, can't think of his name. You guys know what I'm talking about. And then the other rich guy, Brent, what's his name? Richard. So the three that are trying to go to space and just recently, they're all in this. We're all in this, and I've seen people put memes, is that how you say it, on Facebook. Yeah, Elon Musk, Richard Branson, thank you. Wanting to, you know, comparing these guys wanting to just get off this planet and get to, spend all these billions of dollars they have getting in space. And you got all the poverty that's going on here. Same thing, different direction.
Yep.
And they have the power with their money to solve poverty.
Yep, they sure do. And it's really interesting because his Jeff Bezos' ex-wife, Mackenzie Scott, she actually has, just for 1 year, I think it was 2021, she has donated $8.5 billion. Billion. And I found it really interesting. I think it was one of the articles that was posted on WhatsApp that she gave, I think in total she gave like 20 billion, something like that. But she made sure, and she gave to some religious groups, religious churches and things, but she made sure the one church she would not give any money to was the Evangelical church. Isn't that interesting? But yeah, in parallel, when you look at his ex-wife and what she gives versus what Jeff Bezos, I mean, he doesn't give that much in accordance to the money that he makes,
Yeah.
Yeah, the other ones are more, give more, what is that other guy? Melinda and Gates, they give a lot. They give a lot. They give a lot of their wealth. Okay. In most secular colleges and universities, the largest evangelical organization was Campus Crusade for Christ. Founded in 1951 by Bill Bright, a conventionally right-wing Presbyterian, to evangelize students and instruct them in the conservative religion and politics. Still on many campuses, the InterVarsity Christian Fellowship flourished and became a locus for evangelical dissent. Founded in Britain and rooted in the tolerant English evangelical tradition, the ministry emphasized fellowship and religious studies. It published books, encouraged critical thinking, and gave students leave to raise the issues of their generation, such as racism and the Vietnam War.
So maybe it was a mistake to them to teach critical thinking.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I think today, Campus Crusade for Christ, I think they're mainly deal with the youth that are in drug addiction things. So they work, that's where their emphasis is now, but they're not as influential today.
Where was that reference up here? You just read, oh, here it is. Okay, so still a number such as Wheaton and Calvin and Dutch Reformed College taught critical thinking and offered a wider range of intellectual fare.
Yep.
Okay, so most evangelical students, wherever they went, remained as politically conservative as their parents, but some responded to reformist causes. So it seems like this is kind of the culprit.
Yeah, they're teaching them to think for themselves.
Yeah, dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I think you're in here.
I think I remember reading an article and it said something about today's youth lack critical thinking, like on an epic level. They just lack that on a big scale.
It's really, to me, it's interesting because when I was raising my kids, I had kind of already come to places in my life to realize that we don't think, we just need to think. If we just actually thought about things, we would be able to see with with a healthy perspective. But we just, people just don't think. They just do and do without thinking and seeing, cause and effect and all that. So when it came to raising my kids, I was really different on, like when they were really young, allowing them to, I would explain to them, tell them, you're not supposed to do this and this is why. And I would actually explain it to them. And I've shared this story before, but I would explain it to them why not to do something. So that later on, should they, like they would, because kids do these kind of things, they go try and do the things you tell them not to do, then they can understand cause and effect. They can think, they can learn to think. And I gave them opportunities to think on their own and encourage thinking on their own. And to me, I saw it as a benefit when they become adults, because they got to go out in the world and live and survive, and they need to be able to think or critically think on their own. And so both of them are thinkers, and I'm happy to that. I won't share the rest of that story, the other part of that side part of that story, so we can keep reading. But I did have an incident with my son where he missed me. He wanted me to continue to teach him and all that. So
Well, that is such a blessing. I mean, because I know in my lifetime, in my little life here, I was taught not to think and not to talk, not to speak. You don't speak. You're not allowed. Nobody wants to hear you anyway.
but that's how I grew up.
Yeah.
And, yeah, feeling like anything that I said was of no importance whatsoever. I mean, I remember when I was a kid being told to shut up. That's not even funny, and yet somebody, one of my sisters would have said something just the same, and it was funny when they said it. And so when I would, so I learned to not think and not say anything, because whoever I was, it was totally unimportant. But I never wanted my kids to be that way. I wanted them to, I wanted them to be prepared to be adults.
Yeah.
Because that does not prepare a child to become an adult.
No, it does not. And I remember vividly, my mom told me one time, or we were talking, in the family thing, and she said, "Oh," and she wasn't accustomed to giving me compliments. And she would say, "Donna was such a good child. She was such a good baby." And I looked at her and I went, "I was? Why? What did I do?" And she goes, "Well, you never cried. And when I put you in the crib, you didn't cry, and you just sat there and you didn't say anything." And I thought, wow, even when I was a baby, I was scared to death to say anything. As a baby, I was scared to death to say anything or to even cry. And that's what made me a good baby.
Making you a good baby.
I was like, wow. That my mom was like, a good baby is you don't do anything, you be quiet, and you don't even cry.
Right.
Isn't that interesting? So when I left, because I tried to run away, but my dad would catch me and go, "You know what? You can't run away until you're 18. I'm like, "Okay, I'll wait till I'm 18. The day I made 18, I left. And there was just like fire in my mom's eyes that I would actually have a mind of my own and take initiative and leave.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's a little thing. Anyway, okay, here we go. Still on many campuses, the InterVarsity Christian Fellowship flourished and became a locus for evangelical dissent. Founded in Britain and rooted in the tolerant English evangelical tradition, the ministry emphasized fellowship and religious studies. It published books and encouraged critical thinking, and gave students leave to raise the issues of their generation, such as racism and Vietnam War. At the ministry's triennial convention in 1967, students protested the cultural imperialism of InterVarsity missionaries and asked why the organization had no African American or women on its staff. In the next convention in 1970, Tom Skinner, a former Harlem gang leader and a star evangelical preacher, delivered a fiery speech about racism in America, and students voiced indignation about Billy Graham's connection with Nixon, and in particular, his celebration of the presidents at Knoxville Crusade.
It's interesting how they could come, how the evangelicals or the conservative side could come to recognize cause and effect, and why they would not want to allow their kids to become critical thinkers. Because when you taught critical thinking, look what happened to the students. So they saw critical thinking. I would think they'd come from cause to effect to see critical thinking as a dangerous thing, to not allow your kids to grow up learning how to think on their own.
Right.
It's amazing because it's such a disservice to children. Okay, so it took them to see what you're doing is wrong.
Right.
But if you were truly doing what is right for your kids and raising them to think on their own, we wouldn't have so many screwed up people in this world. Because that, to me, I mean, that was a total disservice. I know in my life, and I've seen it in the lives of others, it's a total disservice to not raise a child with the attitude and understanding that you're raising a child that has to go live in the world.
Right.
You need to be able to develop and grow and be independent and be strong and be healthy emotionally. And so when you just, all they did was mold them. They just wanted to mold them. And critical thinking took them outside the mold. And when they got outside the mold, they were able to look back and see, wow, what you're doing is really bad.
Yes.
And that was a threat. That became a threat.
Yes, it did. It's really it's really very selfish for parents not to want their children to learn and to, it's a selfish act, I think, because for you not to think of your children's future and how they're going to, evolve in the world, and they're not going to be children forever, and you have to train them, to be able to, evolve in just society, and to keep them in your mindset, in their mindset, the parents' mindset, and it's just kind of, I think it's very selfish.
And they wanted to carry on as they carried on, and with their values and their attitudes and their beliefs, instead of develop their own.
Instead of letting their children choose for themselves what life they want,
right,
and what path they would like to go on. And yeah.
If I may, I don't think we should be too harsh on these parents, because we are a product of our environment. There was a whole study, done. I'm a baby boomer. My wife, Lugina, and I, we're baby boomers. And so group before that, they were called something else. And the group before that were called something else. And, we're all, because we lived in that time, we were taught, and we only, we could only teach what we were taught. So, with the war, like the World War II people, they were taught to be obedient and loyal to the country, and things like that. Whereas now, we're in a revolution, so people are more free to think. And so if we change with the time, we can, like for me, being raised Korean, shut up and stay out, and unseen and unheard. So coming to the United States, it was very different. For example, one of the things that we were never allowed to do is in Korea, I don't know about other Asian countries, we were never allowed to look adults in the eyes. That was very offensive to the adults. If you eyed someone, same thing in the army. Same thing with the army. If you eyed someone, it was a big disrespect. But now, coming to the United States, if you don't look them in the eye, that's a sign of disrespect. So a lot of it's a cultural thing. A lot of it's the society that you live in, the age that you grew up in. So fortunately now for us, we're in this time of revolution, and we are allowed to think, and we are allowed to pass things to our children. And like we said earlier, a lot of our children, with their liberal mindset, are way ahead of us. I know, like my children are way ahead of us, and as far as the treatment of the society, treatment of people, way they treat the LGBTQI people. They're way ahead of us. We're just catching up.
Yes, I agree that a lot of it is cultural, and they lived in a different time. Would you like to read, Phil? Phil?
Yeah, I just muted myself again. So here we go. Okay. In the early 1970s, other centers of the evangelical left emerged. Urban communes with underground newspapers advocated for causes such as minority rights, fair wages for farm workers, and economic justice for developing countries. One such center, the People's Christian Coalition, was founded by divinity students in Chicago. Its energetic leader, Jim Wallace, not atypically, came out of the secular student left. Growing up in the suburbs of Detroit, Wallace had rebelled against the middle-class evangelicalism of his family. He went to Michigan State University, where he served in student government and joined Students for a Democratic Society. As a senior, he helped organize the national student strike after the Cambodia invasion and the shootings at Kent State. When the protests turned violent, he quit SDS and in disillusionment went to Trinity Evangelical Divinity School with the thought of becoming a minister. At the conservative seminary, he quickly started a heated debate about the Vietnam War and gathered a group of other rebellious students around him. In late 1971, the group moved out of the seminary, formed a commune, and created a blend of evangelicalism and new left politics. Its bi-monthly paper, The Post-American, was dedicated to awakening the evangelical community from its folk religion of convenience, conformity, and presidential prayer breakfast to a Christian radicalism challenging the corrupt values of our culture, the injustices of a racist society, and an exploitative system. Later, the group, renamed Sojourners, removed to Washington, D.C., and Wallace, growing more politically moderate, became the most recognizable voice on the evangelical left for the next several decades. Most of this ferment occurred in the North. The civil rights movement had produced a number of committed Southern Baptist activists, but many of these, in bitter disappointment with the churches that had nurtured them, quit the denomination or moved to its fringes. One of these rebels, a minister in rural Ohio in 1965, started a small magazine, The Other Side, dedicated to Black civil rights. The magazine, however, became well known only when his son and two friends from Wheaton reestablished it in Philadelphia and broadened its focus to gender issues, global justice, and communal living. In the late 1960s, a number of Southern Baptist college students staged anti-war rallies. They called for gender equality, and some went to work in inner city missions for the poor. Many hoped for social progress, but they never challenged Southern Baptist institutions or formed a center for left-wing ideas. By the early 1970s, the Northern evangelical left included not just student groups and communes, but a number of young academics working on issues of faith and social justice. These scholars belonged to various denominations, but a disproportionate number came from two small groups that had recently moved into the evangelical orbit. Oh, our battery's running low. I got to plug the, okay. Let's see, the Christian Reformed Church with its roots in Holland and a strong tradition of social and political involvement. On the other, Anabaptist sects such as Mennonites and the Brethren in Christ, traditionally pacifist and separated from the world. Some of these scholars were also activists, and one of the most effective was Ron Sider, Canadian-born son of a Brethren pastor with a Master of Divinity and PhD in history from Yale. In New Haven, Sider had worked with InterVarsity and with the NAACP organizing voter registration drive. On graduating from Yale in 1968, he had decided that rather than taking up a career as a secular university, he would go to a new campus of Messiah College in the inner city of Philadelphia and give his efforts to the urban poor. In 1972, he formed a shoestring group, Evangelicals for McGovern, in support of Democratic anti-war candidates for president against the Vietnam War and Nixon's efforts to stir up a white backlash. The group raised more press attention than money, but on the strength of it, he and other McGovernites decided to hold an interdenominational conference as the first step in building a permanent progressive organization. The following year, 50 evangelicals met over Thanksgiving weekend at a YMCA in downtown Chicago to work out a concise statement of their common beliefs and purposes. Chosen to represent the diversity of the social justice movement, the Thanksgiving workshop participants ranged ideologically from Jim Wallace to Carl Henry and included several African Americans and 5 women. The manifesto that emerged after much debate, the Chicago Declaration of Evangelical Social Concern, began with a confession that evangelicals had failed to defend the rights of the poor and oppressed and had been complicit in racism. It went on to attack the unjust distribution of the nation's wealth, the pathology of war and violence, sexism, and the temptation to make the nation and its institutions objects of near religious loyalty. Thanks to Snyder's efforts, the statements gained publicity and the signatures of many other progressive evangelicals, among them that of Senator Mark Hatfield, the liberal Oregon Republican, who backed women's rights and had been an early opponent of the Vietnam War. In 1973, Chicago Declaration was in effect SDS's Port Huron statement of the evangelical left, but it was also the high point of the movement. With a time lag of a decade, the evangelical left had missed the glory days of the civil rights movement and most of the Vietnam War. When Nixon brought the last American regular troops home that year, student passions cooled, having arisen along much the same trajectory as the secular left. The evangelical left fell apart just as the secular movement did over ideology and identity politics. The second and third annual Thanksgiving workshops Sider organized reflected the growing divisions within the movement as a whole.
So you see continuously
At
that,
the 19th,
can you hear me?
Not really.
yes,
You're kind of slow. You're kind of soft.
Okay, so you can see always happening throughout these different histories, this this new school, so to speak, that comes out, the thinkers, the ones that think. But even still, when you go back to, I always think of Elder Tessa's presentation, you go back to the Millerite history, where Ellen White was, her parents were taking her to these revivals, right? The modern revivals. These are people that had come out of that conservative mindset. And so you had that division going on, and that's what she winds up going to. But even in that case, they still, even though they believed in the social gospel and helping and the various things they might have believed in, whatever time frame you're in, they accept these reforms. They still, as Elder Tess was saying, that the coming out of the conservative mindset for us may have been the easy part, and for the world, how the world is, we had to catch up to where the world was, society was. But now you have, now those that are in that liberal side they also have to then step from that. If that makes sense. They have to be able to step from that to this. So both sides are dangerous. There's a ditch on both sides, as we were talking about.
Yes.
I do want to wrap up really on time tonight because I'm not done with my slideshow for Friday. So we'll just go for a couple more minutes and close in prayer. They finish off this paragraph. It looks like it'll finish off the page.
At the 1974 Chicago meeting, Blacks and women withdrew into their own caucuses and came back with complaints about racism and sexism. Meanwhile, a fight broke out between the Anabaptists and the Calvinists. From the Anabaptist caucus came proposals for a meatless day a week and the commitment of families of 4 to live on $8,000 a year. Anabaptist theologians such as John Howard Yoder maintained that Jesus had rejected political power because the state was inherently corrupt and that entanglement in secular politics was fraught with the dangers of compromise. Christians, they argued, should engage in politics only from the outside, through grassroots organizing and through providing a model of nonviolent resistance and a service to the poor. The Calvinists, however, lambasted the approach as naive, impractical, and lacking in careful and informed reasoning. Christ, they maintained, ruled the entire world, not just the church. Thus, Christians should involve themselves in every sphere of life, from the arts and sciences to labor conditions and electoral politics. At the third Thanksgiving meeting, one progressive Calvinist was heard to cry, "All of life is religion. No dichotomy between church and the world. No separation of piety and politics." It was like having Gandhi and Marx in the same room, and the meeting broke up a day early. Well, this Calvinist sounds like the original Calvinist of the time of A.T. Jones.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this has been really good reading and actually good discussion. I appreciate all of it. Does anybody have any comments? Silence.
Yeah, I'm enjoying this book. This is a really good book.
Yeah, I picked up some points that I want to share with my son.
Yeah.
The stuff we were talking about, and just to, you know, and also, like I said, it's always in my mind that's not the end. That's not the end point. That still is a ditch. And but we have to be understanding these things to be able to help as many as those that will be helped to come out and join this movement.
Yep.
So yeah, I really enjoyed tonight's reading. Some of the book has been harder to go through than others. This was really I really like this section of it.
Yeah, me too. I just I can relate to it. I like the whole book, really. I mean, it's just awesome.
Yeah, it is.
I can't imagine. What she did and all the research put into this book. Wow.
Yeah, really good book. Donna, would you like to close in prayer?
Yes, sure. Lord God, we thank you, Lord, what you are doing for your people as well as the world, Lord. You're opening our eyes, but not just our eyes. You're opening our hearts and giving us the compassion and the empathy for others, Lord. It's life-changing. It's truly Christ-like character. It's a blessing. And Lord, we have many faults, each of us, many things that we have to learn and unlearn and to correct things here and there. But you giving us so much encouragement by these messages and by these teachings and parable teaching. It's really a time of, it's almost like the floodgates are open. Like we're getting so much. I just pray you keep us nimble in our minds. You know, many of us didn't have the perfect upbringing. We didn't have parents that helped us to be critical thinkers and to be independent and to think for ourselves and to think about our future and how we would affect the world as an individual. We just didn't have that, Lord. And yet here we are, learning these things that are amazing. What our parents didn't teach us, you're teaching us. Oh, Lord, you're so good. So, so good. Thank you so much, Lord. We pray that you would bless everyone here and bless everyone in the movement and in our little group. And we look forward to the next, to Friday and to Sabbath and the studies and the fellowship that we share with one another. We pray that more of us would be willing to speak out and give opinions and be critical thinkers too. Thank you, Lord. We just give you all the praise and the glory. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
And
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
well, thank you, everybody. Good night. God bless you.